Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeing, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be joined by our viewers and listeners.
Yep, if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation and this is one of your first exposures to the work we do at FFF, our mission is to present the principled, uncompromising case on libertarianism. We've done that for some 30 years. You can subscribe to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, or to our FFF Daily, which consists of multiple articles, including an original article by FFF every day, and all of which brings you the principal case for libertarianism. All right, Richard, let's continue our discussion of socialism that we began a couple of weeks ago. You'll recall that we talked about the general principles of socialism and what a socialist system means in its pure sense, where the government owns everything, all the means of production, the results of production, everyone works for the state, everyone's a government employee, the ramifications of that, the poverty that it inevitably produces across society, the loss of liberty that comes with that society. And so I thought what we would do today, before getting into the specifics of welfare state programs or central planning programs, is to talk generally about variations of socialism, because obviously it's difficult to find societies that are 100% socialist. I think a close example of that phenomenon would be North Korea, perhaps even Cuba, but Cuba's been opening up to a certain extent with industries that are half government-owned and half privately owned, like hotels and so forth. So I think North Korea would be an example of the pure socialist societies. But then there's gradations, and those gradations, I think, come in two different forms. One is what we call the welfare state, where the government uses its force to take money from people to whom it belongs, people who have produced it or inherited it, and then transfers it, gives it to someone else, what I call mandatory charity. It embodies what Karl Marx called from each according to his ability to each according to his need. So while it's not a pure socialist society, it's predominantly socialist in the terms of a massive welfare state way of life, massive mandatory charity. And then there's another aspect of this, of central planning, where the government, through a board of commissars, bureaucrats, public officials, politicians, plans in a top-down, command-and-control fashion, sort of like in the military, the economic or educational or other peaceful activities of multitudes of people, as compared to the opposite kind of system, a free market system where people are free to make their own plans without any government interference or direction. So I thought we would talk about the first aspect of this, the redistributive state, the welfare state, the concept of government taking money from one group of people and giving it to another group of people. Obviously, that is the kind of system that we have here in the United States. It wasn't always that way. The United States, for more than 100 years, was based on the idea that people keep everything they earn and they decide what to do with it. They decide whether to spend it, invest it, donate it to the poor, help their parents out, help hospitals or educational facilities or whatever. That's how Americans perceive the concept of freedom, and it's really how we libertarians perceive the concept of freedom, where a person decides for himself what to do with the money that he himself is producing in the marketplace by engaging in economic transactions with others. That is a different kind of system. It is an opposite kind of system to the system in which we live, which is called a welfare state, or what I call a mandatory charity system, where the primary role of government is to take money from one group of people, primarily through the income tax, but there are other vehicles as well, and transfers it to another group of people in the name of making us good, caring, and compassionate. So why don't you talk a little bit about the welfare state side of this thing? Tell us exactly how this change came to be, and talk a little bit about the nature of it, and then the history of how this massive change took place in America?
Well, the modern interventionist welfare state has its origin in Imperial Germany in the last decades of the 19th century. As we talked about last week, the socialist movement had arisen in the early and middle decades of the 19th century, the 1800s. Not exclusively, but for a variety of reasons, especially in Imperial Germany. For a good while, the Socialist Party, the Social Democrats, had been banned from political participation, precisely out of a fear that they would win votes in the German parliament, the Reichstag. But that ban was lifted, and within a few elections in the 1870s and early 1880s, the Social Democrats were becoming an extremely sizable bloc of deputies voting on legislation in the Russian parliament. This created a lot of apprehension and fear that through the ballot box, rather than through the violence of bullets, a socialist party could come to power in Germany, holding a majority of the seats, and who knows what that could set off throughout Germany. So what to do? Now, at that time, the chancellor, the prime minister of Imperial Germany, was the famous Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. The chancellor who, through a series of wars in the 1860s and early 1870s, had basically succeeded in unifying all of the German states under Prussian leadership into more or less a unified Imperial Germany. But with the growth of the welfare state, the Social Democratic Party, the Democratic Socialists, Bismarck basically came up with the idea of co-opting them. And in fact, in an interview with an American economist and journalist in the 1890s, he even said that my purpose of introducing the welfare state was to co-opt the socialists, to let the masses know that the existing government cared for them and would do things for them. So rather than calling for the radical overthrow of the existing society, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, the idea was to introduce a series of welfare statist, quote, reforms and social programs that would win the quote, the working class, unquote, over to the German conservative and imperial establishment. They would then have them as allies rather than enemies in fighting the, quote, more radical democratic socialists. So in the 1880s and into the 1890s, but particularly the 1880s, Bismarck was able to get the Kaiser's approval, the Emperor of Germany, the Kaiser's approval and the conservatives in the German parliament to pass such programs as their version of Social Security, their version of national health care, their version of worker compensation, unemployment insurance, convalescent homes for injured workers, all of the potpourri of the institutions of the welfare state. Now, every one of these is, in fact, was wanted and advocated by the more radical socialists. For instance, if you look at Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto, which he co-authored and published with Friedrich Engels in 1848, towards the end of it, he says, he offers a 10-part program for, quote, a gradualist movement towards a future socialist society. And what you find there is national health care, pension funds supplied by the government, free education for all, government oversight of the economic affairs of employment and production, all of which would be sort of the gradual steps so that when you woke up your eyes one day having implemented all these, you would be more or less in or well on the way of a socialist society. So in fact, Bismarck does this. And while the Social Democrats maintain a sizable number of seats, it did succeed in winning support. This included the interventionist state, by which private interests and the profit motive needed to be harnessed to serve the wider national and common good. We don't need to nationalize industries. We don't need to impose comprehensive types of central planning as Marx and other socialists are proposing. It is necessary through a series of interventions and regulations to nudge, harness, restrain, direct the private sector what to produce, how to produce, under what work and employee circumstances to produce, so as to see that private initiative was directed within the context of what would serve the national interest and through the welfare state, the good of the workers. Now, as we've talked about a little bit in past episodes, Jacob, this began to influence other European countries, including Great Britain and the United States. Let me talk about the United States first. As I have mentioned in the past, the American educational establishment in the 19th century had very few programs of higher education, universities, that actually offered PhD degrees. You can get a bachelor's degree, you get a master's degree, but there were very few places to earn a PhD in the United States. So the young American scholar wishing to have a capstone to his academic pursuits would go to Europe for a doctoral degree. Certainly England, Cambridge, Oxford, University of London, Paris, the Sorbonne, the University of Paris, for example. But a lot of them were drawn to German universities. Was not Germany the land of poets and scientists, philosophers, and philanthropists? Was not this the country of enlightened learning? So you had American economists, political scientists, historians, sociologists, philosophers travel to Europe and often gravitate to the German universities. Now, at that time, the German universities, particularly in the social sciences, Jacob, were controlled and dominated by what was called the German Historical School. They rejected the classical teachings of people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill about the advantages of free enterprise and free trade. These were rationalized attempts to justify the policies of Britain's pursuit of global domination and profits for the few. So instead, what Germany had to have was an enlightened, progressive outlook on policies to nurture the well-being of the populace, as well as advancing the true and global interests of the nation as a whole. And so what happened is that when these American academics, students, graduate students, went off to the University of Heidelberg, Hamburg, Berlin, Munich, and so on. And what they did is they ended up studying with these German historicists who said, we have to look beyond the private and personal interest. We have to be concerned with the social good, solving the social problems of our day, the needs of the downtrodden, the unclad and hungry masses. But we cannot trust the hands of private businessmen who are ready to exploit, abuse, underpay those who work for them while living in their mansions and being driven around in their horse-drawn fancy carriages. We must have an enlightened policy of social welfarism, but one that is loyal to the state, none of this radical Marxian or other socialist stuff. Well, these American students imbibed all this. That classical economics of free enterprise and free trade and laissez-faire, that's all passé. Each nation has to find the right set of pragmatic policies that suits the social needs and interests of their society at different moments in time. The new hallmarks of thinking about public policy were, and these were these words, the Germans and then the Americans who followed them, pragmatism, expediency, the needs of the democratic interests of the time, of the masses, through enlightened overseeing government. And so they came back and they filled over a couple of decades the universities in the professorships, advisors to politicians, some of them running for political office themselves, involved in social campaigns for legislation to implement versions of the welfare state. A leading advocate and proponent of this was Woodrow Wilson, who was a political science professor, who was the president of Princeton University, wrote a book on the state and the passéness of the American constitutional structure, division of powers, limits on the federal government. We're a complex society today. We need unified, enlightened, centralized leadership with the discretion of power to do the right interventions, regulations, and welfare state policies for the good of the society as a whole. And then this all accelerated, particularly with those people and their students who studied with them, with the coming of the New Deal in the 1930s during the Great Depression, which saw the institutionalizing of unemployment insurance, Social Security, the beginning of government health care support, minimum wage laws, the whole litany of what we now view, and of course the growth of government intricate and comprehensive regulation and control and oversight of private industry, far more than even the progressives had been attempting to introduce in the 19-teens and the 1920s. So as a consequence, we now have this shift that you're no longer calling for socialism. We can achieve all the goals of socialism, a fair redistribution of wealth, through regulation harnessing private businessmen to direct their interests towards serving the nation rather than selfish personal purposes at the expense of others and the country. And so that we can have socialism without socialism. We can have all of the desirable ends, but without the radical means of government takeover of everything, as has been supported by those more radical Marxian types. Now, the one other thing I should mention here is that this was going on in Great Britain as well, because beginning in the 1890s, there emerged what was called the Fabian Society, of which the famous playwright George Bernard Shaw was a prominent member. The famous musical My Fair Lady is a takeoff of one of his famous plays, Pygmalion. And he was a radical advocate of these types of enlightened public policies, including, I should mention, and many progressives were in the late 19th and early decades of the 20th century, eugenics. If we're going to plan the society, urban planning for better cities, industrial planning for industry that serves the people, properly produced and distributed, if we're going to rationally organize agriculture, should we not also plan the qualities and characteristics of the people? Is this not for the people? So these are big advocates of people planning as well as social and economic planning. But this came to Britain through these Fabians who began to say everything gradually, no radical. Let's introduce this little welfare state activity, that redistribution of wealth, this regulation, this government control, this little narrow nationalization of this small segment of the economy, municipal services like the trolley service or the utilities. And then this got reinforced in the first decade of the 20th century, Jacob, with the, if I can say it, the liberal government of Great Britain at the time under Prime Minister Lloyd George. He made a state visit to Imperial Germany. This is the decade before the First World War. And he's greatly taken with the example of the German welfare state. And he has one of his cabinet members and assistants with him on this trip to Imperial Germany, who also inhales all of this stuff about enlightened government paternalism. And who is that? Winston Churchill. So Lloyd George comes back with the support of someone like Churchill, and they start pushing through in 1911 the first programs that became eventually the British national healthcare system. So as a result, Jacob, in the 1930s, by the 1930s, you now had a shift in the policy views of most intellectuals, a large number of policymakers across the political spectrum, in academia, out of academia, in the arena of policymaking, who now said that we can now have these enlightened policies to alleviate the oppression of the masses, the exploitation of workers, a fairer distribution of wealth, through an array of paternalistic activities the government could now undertake without the radicalism of a full nationalization of the economy or the implementation of a central planning apparatus, or the fear of some that with socialism would come a form of political tyranny. And that is basically what has become the dominant ideas of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. The idea of a government that is more paternalistic, a government that is more redistributive, a government that is more regulatory. And this has basically become the social philosophy of most governments and most nations around the world. This is the socialism of the 21st century that is now advocated by some in society. And so it is just socialism under different labels and different names.
Yeah, that's an excellent summation. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Otto von Bismarck, because if you go to the website of the Social Security Administration, which of course is the crown jewel of the welfare state, they have a bust of Otto von Bismarck, not of James Madison or Thomas Jefferson or Patrick Henry, of Otto von Bismarck. I mean, this is their model, this German Iron Chancellor, who was responsible for co-opting the principles of socialism from the German socialists and making them part of Germany. I think it's important to go back to where the nation started to show the tremendous difference of where we are now. Now, prior to the establishment of the United States, governments throughout history had regulated economic activity and managed economic activity. You had the poor relief laws, and the whole idea was government needs to help the poor because there's evil, greedy, profit-seeking people that are going to take advantage of the poor. So you had price controls, and you had anti-speculation laws and anti-middlemen laws, and this whole regulatory environment that existed really throughout civilization, the Middle Ages, mercantilism, and so forth. So everything radically changes with the establishment of the United States, that the American people take the principles in the Declaration of Independence that had been published in 1776, natural God-given rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They incorporate the principles of Adam Smith and his famous treatise, The Wealth of Nations, and they come up with a system where they say government's not going to be involved in economic activity anymore, that this is the reason why mankind has been mired in poverty. We're going to do something different here. People are going to be free to keep everything they earn. They're going to decide what to do with it. Enterprise is going to be free of government control or management. And that's the concept of free enterprise, the idea that enterprise would be free of government management or control, and that people would be free to keep whatever they had and decide for themselves what to do with it. So here you have this system which was remarkable in the history of the world, and it produces this massive increase in the standard of living of people in the 19th century. You had open immigration where people were flooding in to take advantage of this with a hope of getting wealthy, and many did get wealthy, or at least entered the middle class. The Americans were showing how to abolish poverty in a very real, practical sense through the accumulation of wealth and capital that raised people's productivity, made them wealthier, higher standards of living. So what's fascinating to me, Richard, is that you have this system for more than 100 years, and the socialists come along, and they have a tremendous challenge here. How do you get Americans to give up this system? Now, we're dealing now with maybe the 6th or 7th generation of Americans, the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of the people who founded the country. But how do you convince these people to give up a system of no income taxation, where you're free to keep everything you earn, where there's open immigration, there's no government management or control of the economy, no welfare state? And yet they were able to do that. I mean, this is the power of this siren song of socialism. The government's going to be providing the safety net. There's no more going to be vicissitudes of life that you need to worry about, the changes of life, that government's going to be there to protect you, keep you safe, provide you with a safety net so that you don't hit the ground if you fall from the trapeze wire. And people imbibed that. It was like, wow, this is fantastic. We can have wealth and growing standards of living while the government is ensuring that nothing bad happens to us. And that's that famous trade-off between liberty and security. The government was saying, and the socialists were saying, give up a little bit of your liberty for the security of the welfare state. And they've succeeded in doing that. I mean, you have this massive transformation going into the 20th century, not only on the welfare state side, but on the warfare state side. Woodrow Wilson, who you mentioned earlier, leads America into this foreign intervention in World War I, which was totally contrary to the founding principle of non-intervention. But then you have all these regulatory commissions coming in, especially after World War I. They were treating them like the war. Have all these bureaucracies and stuff. And then you've got the Great Depression. Well, you've got the Federal Reserve that comes into existence. The income tax comes into existence both in 1913. The Federal Reserve messes everything up in the 20s with its monetary policies. They end up going into the Franklin and Roosevelt administration, destroying the finest monetary system in history that had contributed to this giant standard of living increase. And then Roosevelt really is the guy that's responsible for adopting formally the whole welfare state way of life with Social Security. But there was a tremendous battle going on. This is what a lot of Americans don't realize. Tremendous battle that was going on intellectually and in the law fields too in the late 1800s between the socialists and the so-called capitalists over the direction of America. It culminates in the Roosevelt administration, where you just had this tsunami of feeling towards socialism and the security of the socialist welfare state that ends up transforming American society.
Yeah, I think that part of the problem is that if you read accounts of visitors traveling to the United States, and I've written about this in some articles, European visitors to the United States in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, what were their impressions of this new experiment in a free society and free government? And then, of course, going back to Europe and writing their books for their own countrymen about, what their observations and reflections on the American experiment. The one thing that many of them commented is that Americans were proud of being Democrats, with a small d, in the sense theirs was a free society of representative government, regardless of labels. The idea was the people ruled through their representatives. And as a result of this, government reflected the will of the people. Now, of course, back then, the voting franchise was much smaller than we take for granted, but it didn't matter whether people had the franchise vote or not. At that time, they considered that the fact that a large segment of the population could elect people to public office, which was obviously the exception to the rule given the world at that time, including Europe. The idea was that America had a government that represented the will of the people. So anything that the government finally did, taking the long view, could not oppress the people because it was a reflection of the will of the people. Now, once you have that broad notion of what democracy means, a monarch could oppress the people, but how can the people oppress themselves if they elect the representatives to political office? So as a consequence of this, when the socialists are making this case, well, it's the will of the people. They elect representatives. They're the deputies in a parliament or members of a Congress. They're voting on the legislation. So these policies are not something external to the society imposed upon the people. They're a reflection of the people's will. Isn't that what democracy is all about? And that, playing that card, it seems as if anyone who opposes such policies is itself against democracy and therefore open government, an anti-people government. And they have been very effective with that rhetoric and playing of that card, so much so that that theme continues today.
I think you're absolutely right on. And, people can understand why you don't want to have Democratic vote controlling things like religious decisions. I mean, if the majority, let's say 95% of Americans said, well, everybody's got to go to church on Sunday from now on, or you got to take your kids to church. I think 99% of Americans, if not 100% of Americans, say absolutely not. That is not a subject of Democratic vote. That's a fundamental God-given right, natural right, that this decision is personal. It belongs to me. Whether I go to church or not is no business of the government, no matter what the Democratic vote is. But when you talk about what a person does with his own money, his honestly acquired wealth, the principle is really no different. Because what a person does with his money reflects his values. Whether he goes to uses it to go to church or to donate to his church or does it to go on vacation, these are his own personal decisions, and they should be as sacred as what he does with his religious decisions or his intellectual decisions. So I think that's the problem, is that people lost sight of the concept that economic liberty is as fundamental and natural God-given right as religious liberty and political liberty and other aspects of liberty.
I agree. And you see, it has to do with the meaning of the term self-government. There's basically two forms or facets of the self-government. On the one hand, there is the self-government in which you elect representatives through a voting process for a period of time that reflect the voters' preferences as to who will hold office and the policies that they will implement. And that's self-government in the political sense. But what Americans had, and Americans understood through a good part of the 19th century, is that there's another sense or meaning of self-government and a more fundamental sense of it in a free society. And that means the self-governing individual. The role of the government is to secure the institutional setting, protection of life, liberty, and honestly acquired property through police, courts, armed forces against foreign invaders, and basically then leaving the individuals free in that sort of institutional set of rules of the game. And the institutional rules of the game have basically three rules to them. You don't kill, you don't steal, and you don't defraud or misrepresent. As long as you don't do one of those three things, you are a self-governing individual to choose and find your own values and meanings for your life, and therefore the ends that you want to pursue that will give purposefulness to your sojourn on earth in mundane and profound ways. And then to freely choose the best means to achieve those ends. How do you earn a living? Who do you interact with? Free association, voluntary exchange, mutual benefits through peaceful and agreed upon trade. That was the real and deeper meaning of self-government in the American experiment. The problem is that got shunted aside increasingly, where everything else just became this politicized version of it. Self-government means the expression of the will of the people through the political process. And that self-government of the individual is okay, but that's just the incidental everyday matters of, picking your furniture and, deciding what apartment or house you're going to live in or where you're going to go to dinner. But what's important is this wider issue of self-government where the people decide the national, the community, the social concerns of all of them together. It's the collectivism of the political as opposed to the individualism of the person. And the left has been very successful. These collectivists have been very successful in shunting aside this profound sense of the individual's liberty and co-opting it with this idea that freedom means all of us deciding together and imposing one set of hierarchy of values, goals, purposes, and directions imposed by the government now that we have voted in a majoritarian sense for what is good for all of us.
Yeah, and in the process, they destroy freedom of the individual and the opportunity that the individual has to make these choices on his own. I mean, this is the way you grow. You make these choices. Should I help my parents out? Should I not? Should I help that person out? This is where the conscience is developed through the process of choice. This is the natural, God-given way of free will that causes a person to mature and grow and hatch as a person. They deny people that opportunity. And the insult that is implicit in all this, especially of young people, is that you can't be trusted to make these decisions on your own. Now, notice that God trusted people to make those decisions, but the state, Caesar says, God made a mistake. People can't be trusted with those decisions. Well, people can be trusted, and they should be trusted because that's what freedom and free will are all about. So on that note, Richard, we're out of time, and look forward to talking to you and continuing this conversation in the future.
Yes, just remember, liberty means for you to peacefully and honestly guide your own life and not allow others to do so through the coercive means of government.
Excellent summation. Look forward to talking to you next week, Richard. Thank you.
Take care.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. And again, come and see us at fff.org.